Henry Lewis was a 42-year-old man who seemed to have it all: money, power, status. Yet that night, surrounded by the luxury he'd worked so hard to amass, he felt an emptiness he couldn't ignore. Despite everything, there was one thing his wealth hadn't secured: an heir. Henry wanted a child, not a family. He'd tried marriage twice, and both times it had ended in failure and bitterness. Love, he thought, was an illusion, an expensive one that only brought problems. But a child was different. A child was an investment, a continuation of his legacy. Determined to avoid the pitfalls of relationships, Henry sought a solution as calculated as any business deal. He envisioned a clear, emotionless agreement, just a contract. With his resources, finding someone to carry the pregnancy without strings attached seemed achievable. For him, this wasn't about love. It was a transaction, and he would have total control. The next morning, Henry drove his sleek sports car through the bustling city streets. His mind was consumed with the task ahead. Stopped at a red light near downtown, something caught his eye. On the sidewalk corner sat a young woman, sketching on a scrap of paper. Her messy brown hair fell across her face, and though her appearance was disheveled, her piercing blue eyes shone with determination. Most people passed her by without a glance, but Henry couldn't look away. As the light turned green, he sped off, shaking his head. Who sits on the sidewalk drawing like nothing else matters? He thought, annoyed with himself for even noticing her. Yet a few blocks later, a nagging feeling made him stop. Sitting in a parking lot, he stared at the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his instincts pushed him back. Reluctantly, he turned the car around. She was still there, her focus unwavering as she leaned her paper against a wall. Henry pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. His tone was cold, direct. "Hey you, come here." The young woman looked up, suspicion flashing in her eyes. She hesitated. "I'm not asking. Get over here, I don't have all day," he snapped. Slowly, reluctantly, she approached. Up close, her thin frame and worn clothes were even more evident. But there was something in her posture, a quiet strength. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm despite its softness. Henry studied her for a moment. "Get in. We need to talk." She laughed dryly. "I'm not one of those, if that's what you're thinking." He frowned, irritated. "Don't be absurd. I don't have time for that. Just get in the car, or go back to your sidewalk. Your choice." Her hesitation lingered, but his authoritative tone left no room for argument. Finally, she opened the door and climbed in. The silence in the car was heavy. Henry drove to a quiet cafe, far from the city noise, and they sat at a secluded table. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla Parker," she replied, her voice edged with suspicion. "Why does it matter?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Layla, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing like nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "What else is there to do? I've got nowhere to go. I've lost everything. But that's none of your business." Henry ignored her defensiveness. "Fine. Let's get to the point. I want to make you an offer, something that could change your life." Layla narrowed her eyes. "And what would that be?" "I want you to have a child for me." For a moment, she blinked, stunned. Then she let out a nervous laugh. "You're joking, right?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm serious. I'll cover all your expenses, provide full support during the pregnancy, and when it's over, you'll walk away with enough money to start over." She crossed her arms, shaking her head in disbelief. What kind of man makes this kind of offer to a stranger? "The kind who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," Henry replied coolly. "I don't want a relationship, Layla. No emotional drama. Just a child. Simple as that." She stared at him, trying to gauge if he was serious. The cold logic in his words left her unnerved. "This is madness," she said finally. "No woman in her right mind would agree to this." Henry's gaze didn't waver. "No woman in your position would refuse." His bluntness stung, but Layla couldn't deny the truth in his words. She had nothing, not even a safe place to sleep that night. Still, the thought of giving up something so personal for money made her stomach churn. "And after the baby is born?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "You'll receive a substantial sum," Henry said calmly. "Enough to rebuild your life. After that," You'll have no further obligations. No strings attached. Layla looked away, her mind racing. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. But at what cost? That same day, Stephanie, Henry's assistant, escorted Layla to a sleek black car waiting at the building's entrance. As she gazed out the window, the city, once overwhelming and indifferent, now seemed to whisper something new. This wasn't just a ride. It was a passage to a life she couldn't yet grasp. Stephanie, sensing Layla's silence, tried to ease the tension. "You'll like the place," she said with a reassuring smile. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." Layla nodded absent-mindedly, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. Everything felt surreal, like stepping into a dream where nothing made sense. When the car pulled up to Henry's mansion, her breath caught. A monumental iron gate swung open, revealing an estate that looked like a postcard from a world she'd never been part of. The mansion, an imposing structure of marble and glass, stood at the center of meticulously groomed gardens. It was cold, calculated, just like the man who owned it. Stephanie guided her inside, barely giving her a moment to absorb the opulence. The chandeliers sparkled above them, casting fragmented light over marble staircases. Every corner seemed crafted for a magazine spread, leaving Layla feeling out of place. "I'll show you to your room," Stephanie said with a cheerful tone that only amplified Layla's unease. "It's one of the best suites in the house." The room was breathtaking, larger than any space Layla had ever called home. A massive bed with linen sheets dominated the room, flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the sprawling garden. The bathroom, bigger than her old apartment, gleamed with polished stone and gold fixtures. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Stephanie said before leaving Layla alone. Layla sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers running over the soft fabric of the sheets. Just the night before, she had slept on a cold sidewalk. Now, she was wrapped in luxury. Yet, the air in the room felt heavy. She wasn't a guest here. She was a cog in a business deal. The following days passed in a blur of routine. Meals arrived promptly, prepared by chefs. A team of doctors conducted a battery of exams to ensure everything was in order. True to his word, Henry remained distant, his focus firmly on work. He only appeared to review reports Stephanie prepared about Layla's progress. On one rare occasion, their paths crossed in a hallway. Layla, returning from a medical appointment, saw Henry striding toward her, his posture rigid as always. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone more obligatory than concerned. Layla hesitated before answering. "Everything's as expected, I guess." He nodded, his gaze unreadable. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be, well." The comment lingered in her mind long after he walked away. Was it genuine, or was it just part of ensuring the deal went smoothly? One quiet night, Layla stepped out onto the balcony of her room. The garden below glowed under the soft light of the moon. Hugging herself against the chill, she gazed at the stillness around her. "Am I doing the right thing?" she whispered to the night. Carrying a child only to give it away. It had seemed simple when she signed the contract. Now it felt like a storm brewing inside her. How could she walk away from a part of herself? Meanwhile, Henry watched from the shadows of his study. The sight of Layla standing alone in the moonlight struck him. She was more than just a participant in his plan. There was a depth to her he hadn't expected. A few evenings later, Henry found Layla in the garden. She was seated on a bench, her face tilted toward the sky. The sight caught him off guard. She looked peaceful. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his voice breaking the stillness. Layla turned, surprised to see him. "It's nice. Better than the streets," she said, her honesty disarming. He sat beside her, maintaining a polite distance. "Are you settling in?" Layla shrugged, her gaze drifting to the flowers. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Henry nodded, his expression impassive. "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need, so things go as planned." "As planned," she echoed, a hint of irony in her voice. "Do you always live like this? Planning every second of your life?" Her question caught him off guard. "Planning prevents failure," he said after a pause. "It's how I built everything I have." Layla shook her head with a faint smile. "Not everything can be controlled, Henry. Sometimes things just happen whether you want them to or not." Her words lingered as they parted ways, leaving Henry to wrestle with the unease they stirred in him. During a medical appointment days later, they heard the baby's heartbeat for the first time. The sound filled the room, resonating in a way neither of them had expected. Layla blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the moment. Henry, on the other hand, stood frozen. His expression remained composed, but something in his eyes flickered, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. On the drive back, neither spoke. The weight of what they'd heard lingered in the silence. When they reached the mansion, Henry surprised her by opening the car door. "Thank you for today," Layla said softly. "It was the least I could do," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." In the days that followed, Henry's demeanor began to shift. He appeared more often, lingering in the common areas of the house. Their conversations, while brief, grew less mechanical. He asked about her well-being, her appointments, even her hobbies. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Henry broke the silence. "Have you thought about what you want to do after this is over?" he asked, catching Layla off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. It was the first time Henry had shown any real interest in Layla's future. "I don't have any plans," she replied honestly. "I still don't know what my life will look like after this." Henry nodded, seeming to consider her words. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want. Just make sure you do something worthwhile." Layla looked at him, intrigued. Beneath the calculated coldness, there seemed to be a trace of genuine concern. She didn't know how to interpret it, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone in the mansion. The next morning, Layla found a package left at the entrance of her room. It was impeccably wrapped, with a small handwritten note attached. "To help with your free time." Inside was a brand new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Layla was speechless. She hadn't thought Henry knew about her love for drawing. During one of their early conversations, she had casually mentioned how she used to draw to distract herself, but she never expected him to remember, let alone care. That evening, while she was in the garden, Henry passed by and stopped for a moment. "Did you like the gift?" he asked casually. "Yes," Layla replied, holding the sketchbook close. "Thank you. I didn't expect this." Henry shrugged. "It seemed like something that might be good for you." Layla smiled, clutching the gift tighter. "It was," she said simply. Despite the carefully curated comfort of the mansion, Layla began to realize that it wasn't enough to dispel the turmoil she felt inside. Each day brought a sense of emptiness, as if she were physically present but disconnected from the world around her. Henry, with his usual stoic demeanor, remained an enigma. Yet, there were moments when Layla thought she caught glimpses of something deeper, something he didn't let show. One morning, Henry surprised her with an unusual request. He wanted to talk after breakfast. This was out of character, given the distance he usually maintained. After the meal, Layla met him in the sitting room, where he waited next to a stack of papers. "I want to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said directly. Layla's heart tightened. Was he about to impose new conditions? "More details? I thought everything was already settled," she replied, trying to mask her tension. Henry watched her for a moment before continuing. "It's nothing that changes the terms. I just want to ensure you understand how things will work after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Layla took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I think I get it. I'll leave, and you'll go on with your life." He gave a small nod. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." She raised an eyebrow, surprised by his offer. His tone was different, almost considerate. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, unable to hide her sarcasm. Henry simply shrugged. "I don't want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Layla chuckled, but his seriousness made her pause. Maybe he really was trying to be different, even if he didn't know how. Later that day, she decided to explore the mansion further. The place was immense, with seemingly endless hallways and rooms adorned with artwork that likely cost more than she could imagine. As she wandered, she came across a small study at the end of a hallway. The door was slightly ajar and she peeked inside. Henry was seated at the desk, holding a framed photograph. He wasn't working. He was staring at the picture, lost in thought. Layla couldn't make out the details of the image, but something about his posture caught her attention. She knocked softly on the door, and he quickly set the photo down. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said hesitantly. Henry looked up, surprised to see her. "It's nothing," he replied, his expression returning to its usual neutral state. "Did you need something?" "No," Layla said, hesitating. "I was just exploring the house." She paused, feeling like she should say more. "You seemed like you were thinking about something important." Henry stayed silent for a moment before replying. "We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves." Sensing he didn't want to continue that topic, she shifted the conversation. "This house is huge. Do you live here alone all the time?" He nodded, crossing his arms. "It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here I have the space I need." Layla studied him, trying to understand how someone could live surrounded by so much luxury yet seem so lonely. "That must be strange," she said without thinking. "Having all this, but no one to share it with." Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone to do what I do." Layla wanted to believe him, but his tone suggested otherwise. Before she could respond, Henry stood up. "If you need anything, Stephanie can help," he said, effectively ending the conversation. That night, Layla went out to the mansion's terrace. The sky was clear, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. Sitting there, she let her mind wander. She thought about the sound of the baby's heartbeat she had heard during the last checkup, a sound that affected her in ways she couldn't explain. When she heard footsteps behind her, Layla turned and saw Henry. He looked tired but carried the same rigid posture as always. "You like this spot, don't you?" he asked as he approached. "I like the silence," she replied. "It helps me think." He stopped beside her, gazing at the city lights for a moment. "Thinking isn't always a good thing," he said softly. Layla laughed, but without much humor. "Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone." Henry didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Sometimes, being surrounded by people doesn't help much either." She glanced at him, noticing a sadness in his words she hadn't heard before. "Maybe you need something you can't control, Henry," she said without filtering her thoughts. He frowned as if wanting to respond but decided against it. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Layla with her own thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Layla realized she couldn't maintain the emotional distance she had tried so hard to uphold. And Henry, for his part, began to see this arrangement was far more complex than he had anticipated. Neither of them realized they were being drawn into something far deeper than either had planned. Layla finally broke the silence. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she said, trying to lighten the tension. Henry sighed, his eyes fixed on the road. "I'm not," he admitted. "But this—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is different." Layla glanced at him, intrigued. Henry rarely showed emotions, but now he seemed lost in thought. "Is it scary?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned slightly to look at her before answering. "No. It's impressive, knowing that in a few months, two completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Layla felt a pang in her chest. She knew she would eventually have to let go of the babies, but hearing him talk about them with such care made her realize just how connected she already was to them. "They also depend on me, at least for now," she said, trying to hide the emotion in her voice. Henry nodded. "I know. And that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Layla. Not just physically, but in every way. That's important to me." She stayed silent, absorbing his words. It was the first time he had spoken so sincerely about what they were going through together. Later that night, Layla stood on the terrace, gazing at the horizon. The cool evening breeze swept through her hair as she tried to quiet her thoughts. Henry appeared again, his usually confident demeanor tinged with hesitation. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he began, sitting next to her. "Two babies. Two futures." Layla turned to him, surprised by his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked. "It's more than that," Henry said, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights. "This is the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these two will become. I can't control who they'll grow into." Layla felt a chill at his words. It was rare for Henry to admit that something was beyond his control. She realized that, like her, he was changing, though reluctantly. "Sometimes that can be a good thing," she said. Not knowing what's next. It can bring things you never imagined. Henry looked at her, as though considering her words for the first time. He seemed to be grappling with the idea that not everything in life could be planned. In the following days, the news about the twins brought an unexpected lightness to the mansion. Stephanie began making adjustments to the nursery, adapting it for two. Layla watched the transformations with mixed feelings. She knew the agreement required her to give up the babies, but deep down, she realized it would be far harder than she had imagined. As preparations continued, Layla and Henry found themselves drawn closer. The contract that had initially united them now felt like the foundation of something far more complicated. The morning started like any other. Layla, feeling the weight of pregnancy, moved through her routine with determination. Henry, as usual, was buried in documents in his office. But just before lunch, Layla felt a sudden pain. It was different from anything she had experienced before. She tried to brush it off as a typical pregnancy ache, but the intensity increased. Alarmed, she called for Stephanie, who immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. "Henry needs to know," Stephanie said, helping Layla sit down. "This could be the start of labor." Layla nodded, trying to control her breathing as another wave of pain struck her. Henry appeared in the room within minutes, his usually impassive face showing something rare. Genuine concern. "Layla, what's happening?" he asked, quickly approaching. "I think it's happening," she gasped. "The babies are coming." For a moment, Henry froze, but he quickly regained control. Grabbing his phone, he ordered the driver to ready the car and instructed Stephanie to gather everything they'd need for the hospital. "We're going now," he said, his voice firm but edged with urgency. The ride to the hospital was a blur of emotions. Layla focused on managing the pain while Henry, seated next to her, watched her with a mix of anxiety and determination. He held her hand during the drive, a gesture that seemed automatic but was full of meaning. "We're almost there," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Layla didn't respond, but she felt an unexpected calm from his words. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. A medical team was already on standby, thanks to Henry's meticulous planning, and Layla was taken straight to the delivery room. Henry stayed by her side, refusing to leave despite the staff's attempts to convince him otherwise. "I'm staying," he said firmly, holding her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were intense. Layla's strength as she brought the twins into the world left Henry in awe. Every moment felt endless, yet filled with a profound intensity he had never experienced. When the first cry echoed through the room, Henry's breath caught, and when the second followed, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of pride, awe, and fear. Layla, exhausted but smiling, looked at him as the nurses handed her the babies. For the first time, Henry allowed himself to truly feel the weight of the moment. 2 lives, 2 futures, and everything had changed. The sound of the first cry filled the room, cutting through the sterile quiet like a shockwave of life. It was small yet powerful, its resonance somehow grounding them all in that one moment. It wasn't just the cry of a baby. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something none of them had truly prepared for. "A boy," the doctor announced, a soft smile touching his face as he looked at the newborn, who was already being carefully laid on a nearby table. Henry, standing rigid beside Layla, felt something stir within him. His heart, which had seemed so distant and measured, suddenly began to race. He couldn't take his eyes off the tiny form on the table, the fragile creature that was now part of his life. He had envisioned this moment countless times, yet nothing could have prepared him for how it felt to witness the birth of his child. Before he could fully process the reality of it, a second cry echoed in the room. It was just as piercing, just as raw. A girl, his daughter, Layla, exhausted beyond words, felt the weight of the world in her bones, but she couldn't help but gaze at the 2 babies. Their tiny forms, still wet from birth, were being cleaned and wrapped in blankets. A wave of overwhelming love washed over her, but so did a profound sense of sadness. She wanted nothing more than to hold them in her arms, to feel the closeness of them, but she knew that moment would be fleeting. Time was a thief. Henry remained frozen for a few seconds, watching the doctor work, his expression unreadable. Then, almost as if the dam inside him had finally broken, he stepped forward. Reaching for her hand, he squeezed it gently. His voice, when it came, was low and full of emotion. "You were incredible. Thank you." Silent tears began to slip down Lila's cheeks, though she couldn't tell if they were born from joy, relief, or an ache deep in her heart. Perhaps it was all three. Minutes later, the babies were handed to her one by one. She held them both, their small bodies warm and fragile in her arms. The sheer vulnerability of their life, was almost too much to bear. She studied their faces, taking in the tiny, delicate features that would one day transform into the faces of individuals, people who would one day have thoughts, dreams, and lives of their own. Henry stood by her side, his usually hard expression softening as he looked down at them. When he finally took the boy in his arms, his face, typically so controlled, softened in a way Lila had never seen before. It was as if the weight of the world had been replaced by something more intimate, something infinitely more precious. It was a connection he hadn't expected, and it shook him to his core. When he took his daughter into his arms, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, perhaps to absorb the enormity of it. When his eyes opened again, they locked with Lila's, and she saw something there, a rawness she hadn't thought possible for him. Genuine gratitude. "They're perfect," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Lila nodded, still holding the boy, tears falling freely now though she didn't care. She allowed the grief and joy to wash over her, not wanting to fight either emotion. Not anymore. Later that evening, after Lila had rested, Henry remained by the baby's side in the hospital observation room. He stood there, watching them sleep, an overwhelming flood of emotions roiling inside him. He had been prepared for this moment, or at least he thought he had. But now that he was here, now that he was holding his children in his arms, he realized that everything he thought he understood about his life, about his future, was irrelevant. These children were not just part of a legacy, not just a tool in his quest for control. They were his connection to something greater, something he had never allowed himself to experience. Unconditional love. Stephanie arrived soon after, carrying a cup of coffee for him. She placed it on a nearby table, her gaze briefly flicking to the babies before she asked quietly, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Henry looked at her, but it wasn't the usual cold, calculating gaze. This time, there was something else in his eyes, a confusion, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "For the first time in a long while," he said quietly, as if speaking more to himself than to Stephanie, "I think it is." A soft smile crept across Stephanie's face before she silently left him alone, allowing him to process this monumental shift. Meanwhile, Lila woke in her room, feeling a weight on her chest. She had always known that the day would come when she would have to leave the babies behind. The contract she had signed was still in place, and its terms were unavoidable. The babies, though they had already become the center of her world, would soon be taken from her, and there was nothing she could do to change that. As she sat up and prepared to leave, she glanced toward the babies' cribs. They were both still asleep, their small, peaceful bodies breathing softly. For a moment, she considered staying, truly staying, but the reality of the contract crept back into her mind. She had done her part, and now it was time to move on. She had to stick to the agreement, no matter how much it tore at her heart. Stephanie knocked on her door softly before entering, her face filled with concern. "Is everything ready?" she asked quietly. Lila forced a smile, though her heart was heavy. "Yes. Thank you for everything, Stephanie." The assistant hesitated, then spoke, her voice lower than usual. "Are you sure this is what you want? It seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis. Something has changed." Lila bit her lip, trying to maintain her composure. "It's not about what I want. It's about what was agreed upon." Stephanie didn't press her further but nodded silently, leaving the room to inform Henry that Lila was ready to leave. As Lila descended the stairs, suitcase in hand, she found Henry waiting for her in the foyer. He was standing near the front door, his eyes fixed on her as if she were the only thing in the room. This wasn't the man she had first met, the cold, calculating businessman. This Henry seemed different, vulnerable, maybe even afraid. "Everything's ready," Lila said, breaking the silence. Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his gaze intense, his voice low. "Are you really leaving?" Lila felt a lump form in her throat, but she stood firm. That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on. Henry stood still for a moment, and then, with a quick motion, he reached inside his coat pocket and pulled out the contract. Holding it between his fingers, he looked at it as though it was a meaningless piece of paper. This contract, he began, his voice steadier now, should never have defined what's happening between us. Before Lila could respond, Henry tore the paper into pieces, letting them fall to the floor with a soft rustle, the sound echoing through the foyer like a declaration. I don't want you to go, Lila, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want this to end here. Lila froze, her eyes locked on the torn pieces of paper on the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't move. Henry, you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple. Henry took another step toward her, his expression softening. I know it's not simple. Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Lila. Not just because of the twins, but because you've brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing. Lila's breath caught in her throat as his words hit her like a wave. She shook her head, trying to resist. And how do I know this is real? How can I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't pull away when things get tough? Henry took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for hers. Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone, and it left me empty. You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human. And yes, it scares me, but I don't want to lose this. Lose you. Tears fell freely from Lila's eyes, but there was still a wall in her heart, a barrier she couldn't quite bring herself to tear down. I fell in love with you, Henry, she whispered, her voice breaking. But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again. I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same? Henry moved closer, his presence overwhelming. He took her hands in his gaze locking with hers. Because you changed everything for me. And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Lila, but I'm willing to try. Every day. For the rest of my life, if you give me that chance. Her defenses began to crumble, slowly but surely. She knew there were risks, but for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. What if it didn't work out? She asked herself. But the answer came quickly. Then we'll try again and again if necessary. I won't give up on you. And just like that, the world seemed to stop, the tension between them melting away. Lila realized that, for the first time, she could trust him. And that was enough. Henry took a deep breath as he looked into Lila's eyes, his gaze steady and filled with a depth of emotion that she had not seen before. The words he was about to say were not just a confession. They were a promise, a commitment to a future that he hadn't dared to dream of until now. I want us to be a real family, he began, his voice steady but filled with a vulnerability he rarely showed. Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side forever. Lila felt a flutter in her chest, a mixture of surprise and disbelief. She had known that their feelings for each other had deepened over the past few months, but to hear him say those words so openly, with such sincerity, caught her off guard. She had never imagined Henry, who had once seemed so distant and closed off, could express such tenderness, such longing. Henry continued, sensing her hesitation and wanting to make sure she understood the weight of his words. I know this isn't going to be easy, he said, taking her hands in his. I know I've made mistakes, and I haven't always been the man you needed. But I want to build something real with you. Something that's not just based on contracts or obligations, but on love. I want us to be partners in every sense of the word. Lila was silent for a moment, taking in what he had said. The intensity of his gaze, the rawness in his voice. It all told her that this wasn't just a fleeting declaration. He meant it, but she was still unsure, still scared. Was she ready to take that step? Was she ready to fully open her heart to him, knowing the risks involved? Henry squeezed her hands gently, reading the conflict in her eyes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, he added, his voice steady now. I can't imagine my future without you in it. Please, Lila, let's make this work. Let me prove to you that I can be the man you deserve. Her heart raced as she processed his words. She had spent so much of her life hiding from love, protecting herself from the hurt she had experienced in the past. But Henry was right. This wasn't just about the twins anymore. It was about something deeper, something that she hadn't been willing to admit until now. She had fallen in love with him, and as terrifying as it was, she realized that she didn't want to walk away. "I want that too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want a future with you, Henry." A few weeks later, they decided to make their commitment official in a small, intimate ceremony held in the gardens of Henry's mansion. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining brightly, casting a warm golden glow over the flowers that surrounded the venue. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves of the trees, carrying the scent of blooming roses and lavender. It was perfect. Lila wore a simple yet elegant dress that complemented her figure, and Henry looked dashing in a tailored suit. The twins, dressed in small outfits that made them look even more adorable, were in Stephanie's arms, who couldn't hold back her tears of joy as she watched the couple exchange vows. They both spoke from the heart. Henry promised to be the man Lila deserved, someone who would always stand by her side, who would support her no matter the challenges they faced. Lila, in turn, promised to trust him, to believe in their love, and to help him become the best version of himself. She had seen the changes in him, and for the first time, she believed that he truly wanted to be a better person for her, for the twins, and for himself. The moment they exchanged rings, the small group of friends and family who had gathered to witness the ceremony cheered, their faces beaming with joy. The love and support in the air were palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Lila felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Henry, holding both of the twins in his arms, turned to her with a smile that reached his eyes, a smile she had never seen before. "You make a beautiful family," Stephanie remarked, her voice filled with emotion as she looked at the three of them. It was true. In that moment, standing together, Henry, Lila, and the twins were a family. Not just by blood, but by choice, by love. And that was enough. After the ceremony, life went on as it always did, with its ups and downs, its challenges and its joys. But now everything felt different. The house, which had once felt cold and distant, was now filled with warmth and laughter. Henry and Lila worked together to create a home for the twins, learning to be parents as they went. They faced sleepless nights, dirty diapers, and the constant demands that came with caring for two newborns, but they did it together. One night, after they had finally managed to get the twins to sleep, Henry appeared at the door of their bedroom. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked over to Lila, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her close. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart that had become so familiar to her. "Thank you," he whispered softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Lila closed her eyes, savoring the moment. "Thank you for showing me that I could trust again," she replied, her voice equally soft. The weeks that followed were filled with new experiences and challenges, but also with moments of pure joy. Henry, though still inexperienced, was determined to be the best father he could be. He learned how to change diapers, though he was a bit clumsy at first, and he took turns with Lila feeding the babies, even singing lullabies to them, his rough voice echoing through the nursery. Lila couldn't help but smile at the sight. The man she had once thought was incapable of softness had transformed into a devoted father, and it warmed her heart. One evening, as they sat together on the couch after putting the twins to bed, Henry turned to Lila with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice thoughtful. "What is it?" Lila asked, curious. "I want to build something real with you," he began, his eyes intense. "Not just for the twins, but for us. I want our family to be built on love, not just obligation. I want us to be happy, really happy." Lila listened intently, her heart swelling with emotion. "I want that too," she replied. "But it's not going to be easy, Henry. We have a lot of work to do, and there will be challenges ahead. But if we face them together, I believe we can make it work." Henry nodded, squeezing her hand. "Together," he repeated. The following months were a whirlwind of activity, parenting, working, and learning to balance their new life. But through it all, their love for each other and for the twins only grew stronger. One sunny afternoon, they sat together in the garden, watching as the twins played on a soft mat. Their laughter was infectious, filling the air with a joy that was impossible to ignore. Layla turned to Henry, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Are you happy?" she asked, genuinely curious. Henry looked at her, then at the twins, and a contented smile spread across his face. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said softly. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed, Lila. A family, a purpose, love." Lila's heart swelled as she looked at him, at the family they had built together. "And you've shown me that love can be built, even through challenges," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for that." As they leaned in for a kiss, the twins, who had been babbling happily, suddenly let out a sound that sounded remarkably like Mama and Dada. Lila and Henry both froze, their hearts skipping a beat. They looked at each other, overwhelmed with emotion, before rushing to scoop up the twins in their arms. "Did they just say our names?" Henry asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Lila nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I think they did." And in that moment, as they held the twins close, their hearts full of love and gratitude, they knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was real. And that was all they needed,